I was my family's unpaid therapist for 17 years. When I had my first mental breakdown and asked for help, they told me to stop being dramatic while planning my sister's 40K wedding. Everyone in my family knew that Emma was their emotional emergency contact. Not a therapist, not a crisis hotline, not even their friends. You called Emma first. When my older brother Jake's marriage fell apart at 2 a.m., he didn't call a lawyer or a counselor. He called me, sobbing about how his wife found his affair and was taking the kids. I spent 4 hours on the phone that night walking him through his options while I had to teach first grade the next morning. When my sister Sophie's boyfriend cheated on her junior year of college, I drove 6 hours to her dorm to hold her while she cried for 3 straight days. I missed my own college finals to be there. When my mom's anxiety spirals got so bad she couldn't leave the house for weeks, I was the one researching therapists, making appointments, and driving her to sessions twice a week for 6 months. That was my role. I was 26 years old, and I'd been the family's emotional support system since I was 9, when my parents got divorced and everyone decided that little Emma was so mature for her age and such a good listener. What they meant was that I was convenient, available, and too young to say no. I kept a journal since I was 12, not the cute diary kind, but detailed records of every crisis I managed, every middle-of-the-night phone call, every time I dropped everything to fix someone else's life. I told myself it was just processing, but looking back, I think I knew even then that something was wrong with this dynamic. Last month, everything came to a head during Sophie's wedding planning. She was having her dream wedding, $40,000 budget, 200 guests, destination bachelorette party in Nashville, the works. I was maid of honor, which meant I was basically her unpaid wedding coordinator, therapist, and emotional dumping ground. The week before her wedding, I had what my doctor later called a severe anxiety episode. I'd been having panic attacks for months, wasn't sleeping, barely eating. Work was overwhelming. I teach special needs kids, and budget cuts meant my class size had doubled. My relationship was falling apart because I never had time for my boyfriend between work and family crises. I was drowning. I called Sophie on a Tuesday night, crying so hard I could barely speak. I told her I needed help, that I couldn't handle being everyone's crisis manager anymore, that I was falling apart and didn't know what to do. Her response: "Emma, this is really bad timing. My wedding is in 5 days and I can't deal with your drama right now. Can't this wait until after the honeymoon?" I sat there holding the phone, listening to her actually sigh with annoyance because her sister was having a mental health crisis during her special week. That night, I went through my journals. 17 years of entries, thousands of hours of emotional labor. I added up everything. Every late night crisis call, every weekend spent managing family drama, every vacation cut short, every relationship I'd neglected, every opportunity I'd missed because someone in my family needed me to fix their life. The numbers were staggering. Since age 9, I'd provided approximately 15,000 hours of unpaid emotional support. If I'd charged even minimum wage, my family owed me over $100,000. But it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that not once in 17 years, had anyone in my family asked how I was doing or offered to support me through anything. Sophie's wedding was that Saturday. I was supposed to give a maid of honor speech about what an amazing sister she was, how she'd always been there for everyone. I spent Friday night rewriting that speech based on what I'd learned going through my journals. The wedding was beautiful. Sophie looked gorgeous. The venue was perfect. Everyone was having a great time. When it came time for speeches, I stood up at the microphone and looked out at 200 people who knew our family. "I've been Sophie's sister for 26 years, I began. And in that time, I've learned that being family means showing up for each other, especially in our darkest moments. I paused and pulled out my phone where I'd screenshot dozens of text messages. "Sophie, remember when you called me at 3 a.m. because your college boyfriend was cheating? I drove 6 hours that night to be with you. I held you while you cried and helped you through the worst breakup of your life." The crowd was nodding, thinking this was going to be a sweet story about sisterly support. "Jake, remember when your marriage fell apart and you called me crying about custody and lawyers? I spent 4 hours on the phone with you that night, researching your options and helping you find an attorney. Mom, remember when your anxiety got so bad you couldn't leave the house? I drove you to therapy appointments twice a week for 6 months, missing my own work and commitments. Dad, remember when you were going through your midlife crisis and considering leaving mom? I spent an entire weekend talking you through your feelings and helping you decide to try couples counseling instead." The mood in the room was shifting. People were starting to look confused about where this was going. For 17 years, I've been this family's unpaid therapist, crisis manager, and emotional support system. I've dropped everything, canceled plans, missed opportunities, and sacrificed my own mental health to take care of all of you. Sophie's face was getting red. She was motioning for me to stop, but I kept going. Last week, for the first time in my adult life, I called my sister asking for help. I was having severe anxiety attacks. My relationship was falling apart, and I was having what my doctor now calls a mental health crisis. The room was completely silent now. Sophie's response was that my breakdown was bad timing because her wedding was in 5 days, and could my mental health crisis please wait until after her honeymoon? I looked directly at Sophie, whose mouth was hanging open. "So, in honor of my sister's special day, I want to announce that I'm officially retiring from being this family's emotional dumping ground. Effective immediately, I'm no longer available for crisis management, relationship counseling, or any other emotional labor that none of you have ever reciprocated." The microphone feedback screeched as I set it down and walked out of the reception. My phone started started exploding before I even made it to my car. Sophie was calling and texting frantically. My parents were furious. Jake was demanding I come back and apologize. I turned my phone off and drove home. The next day, I woke up to 73 missed calls and 200 plus text messages. The family group chat had been going nonstop since the wedding, everyone demanding explanations and apologies. I read through all of it, then posted one message. I meant every word I said yesterday. I'm done being your free therapist. Don't contact me unless it's an actual emergency, like someone is dead or dying. Everything else you can handle yourselves or pay a professional. Then I left the group chat. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the true depth of my family's dysfunction has become crystal clear. Update 1. Holy shit. The response to my post has been overwhelming. Thank you to everyone who's shared their own stories about being their family's emotional support person. It's both heartbreaking and validating to know I'm not alone in this. So much has happened since the wedding that I don't even know where to start. I guess I'll go chronologically. The Monday after the wedding, my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced, crying about how I'd ruined Sophie's special day and embarrassed the family in front of 200 people. She kept saying I was being selfish and vindictive and that families are supposed to support each other. I asked her when was the last time any of them had supported me. She couldn't answer. Then she tried a different approach. Guilt. She started talking about how worried they all were about me, how my behavior was concerning, and maybe I needed to see someone about my anger issues. I laughed in her face. After 17 years of telling everyone else to go to therapy, they were now suggesting I needed therapy because I'd finally stood up for myself. I told Mom that she had two choices. She could acknowledge that the family dynamic was toxic and work toward changing it, or she could leave and we could go no contact. She chose to leave, but not before saying I was breaking the family apart over nothing. Wednesday, Jake showed up at my school during lunch. He caused such a scene in the front office that they almost called security. He was yelling about how I was being dramatic and selfish, how family means sacrifice, and how I couldn't just abandon everyone when they needed me. My principal had to ask him to leave. It was humiliating having my colleagues see my family drama at my workplace. But Jake's visit backfired on him. That night, his ex-wife called me. Apparently, Jake had been telling everyone that their divorce was his wife's fault, that she was being unreasonable and vindictive. But when Jake's ex heard about my wedding speech, she reached out to share her side of the story. Turns out Jake hadn't just cheated once. He'd been having affairs throughout their entire marriage. His ex had tried to make it work, had suggested counseling, had asked him to cut contact with the other women. Jake's response was always to call me at 2 a.m., crying about how his wife was being crazy and how he just needed someone to understand him. I realized I'd been helping Jake manipulate and gaslight his wife for years. Every time I validated his feelings and helped him work through his marriage problems, I was actually helping him justify his cheating and abuse. His ex thanked me for finally seeing through his bullshit and setting boundaries. She said hearing about my speech gave her hope that other people would start holding Jake accountable for his actions. Friday, Sophie called me sobbing. Apparently, she and her new husband had their first major fight on their honeymoon. He was upset about how her family had treated me at the wedding and said he was embarrassed to be associated with people who would exploit their own daughter's sister like that. Sophie wanted me to call her husband and explain that the family wasn't really that bad, that I'd just been having a bad week and said things I didn't mean. I told her no. I told her that everything I said was true, and if her husband was smart enough to see the dysfunction, maybe she should listen to him instead of trying to get me to lie for her. She hung up on me. The really interesting thing has been watching how the family functions without me as their emotional dumping ground. It's been 3 weeks and they're already falling apart. Mom called Dad crying about Sophie and her husband fighting, but Dad was dealing with his own drama because his girlfriend, yes, he's cheating on Mom again, was demanding he choose between her and his family. Without me there to talk him through his feelings and help him strategize, he just shut down. He's been ignoring Mom's calls and avoiding family altogether. Jake's girlfriend broke up with him because she got tired of him calling her at all hours crying about how mean his family was being to him. Apparently, when he didn't have me to trauma dump on, he'd been using her as his emotional support system. She told him to get therapy and blocked his number. Sophie and her husband's fights have been getting worse because she keeps trying to get him to take sides against me. He finally told her that she needed to either fix things with her family or stop complaining about them to him because he wasn't going to be her free therapist. The irony is delicious. Last weekend, I went through more of my old journals and found something that made me sick to my stomach. I'd written detailed accounts of every family crisis I'd managed, but I'd also unconsciously documented a pattern of emotional abuse that went back to my childhood. Age 9. Mom having daily crying sessions about the divorce, making me promise not to tell Dad she was sad because it would hurt his feelings. Age 11. Jake asking me to lie to our parents about his grades because he couldn't handle disappointing them right now. Age 13. Sophie making me swear not to tell anyone she was cutting herself, but refusing to get help and threatening suicide if I broke her confidence. Age 15. Dad using me as a messenger between him and Mom during their custody battles, asking me to find out if Mom was dating anyone new. Age 17. Mom having another breakdown during my senior year of high school, making me skip college visits to take care of her because you're the only one who really understands me. I wasn't just their emotional support system. I was their trauma-bonded enabler. They'd been conditioning me since childhood to believe that their emotional needs were more important than mine, that my job was to fix their problems and keep their secrets. Reading those entries was like watching someone else's life. I couldn't believe I'd normalized such dysfunction for so long. This week, I started therapy for myself. My therapist says what I've described is called parentification, when children are forced to take on adult responsibilities and become emotional caregivers for their parents and siblings. She says it's a form of emotional abuse even when it's not intentional. I've been learning about boundaries, about the difference between supporting someone and enabling them, about how to have healthy relationships where emotional labor is reciprocal. Meanwhile, the family drama continues to escalate. Yesterday, Sophie posted a long Facebook rant about toxic family members who abandon you during hard times and people who use weddings as platforms for personal vendettas. She didn't name me specifically, but it was obvious who she was talking about. The comments were mostly supportive of Sophie, but a few family friends who'd been at the wedding commented saying they'd been thinking about what I said and that it made sense why I'd been so overwhelmed. One of Mom's close friends actually commented, "Emma has been taking care of everyone since she was a little girl. Maybe it's time for the rest of you to step up and take care of her for once." Sophie deleted that comment within minutes, but not before I screenshot it. I've been getting messages from extended family members asking for my side of the story. Some are supportive, some are critical, but the fact that people are asking questions means the family's narrative about me being dramatic and selfish isn't holding up under scrutiny. The most unexpected response came from my dad's sister, Aunt Carol, who I haven't spoken to in years. She called me this week and said she'd heard about the wedding from another relative. "Emma," she said, "I owe you an apology. I knew what your parents were doing to you as a kid, making you their little therapist and messenger. I should have said something, but I thought it wasn't my place to interfere. I'm sorry I failed you." She told me that other family members had been talking about the wedding speech and that it had opened their eyes to how much I'd been carrying for everyone. She said she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. That phone call made me cry for an hour. Not sad tears, but relief tears. Someone finally saw what had been happening and validated that it wasn't normal or okay. I'm still not sure what my relationship with my immediate family will look like going forward. Right now, I'm focusing on my own healing and learning what healthy relationships look like. But I can tell you this, I'm sleeping better than I have in years. My anxiety is manageable for the first time in months. My relationship with my boyfriend is improving now that I'm not constantly distracted by family crises. Turns out when you stop trying to fix everyone else's life, you have time and energy to actually live your own. Update 2. It's been 2 months since the wedding, and the family implosion has been even more spectacular than I expected. I'm writing this update because several people have asked for more details, and honestly, documenting all of this has been therapeutic. First, the immediate aftermath of going no contact with my role as family therapist. Week 4, Sophie and her husband separated. Apparently, without me to trauma dump on and get validation from, Sophie started directing all her emotional neediness toward her new husband. She'd call him at work crying about minor inconveniences, expect him to drop everything when she was upset, and got angry when he couldn't read her mind about what she needed. He told her she needed to develop some emotional independence and suggested couples counseling. Sophie's response was to have a meltdown about how everyone is abandoning me and no one understands how sensitive I am. Her husband moved out after she threw a plate at him during an argument about her calling him 23 times during a work meeting. Week 5, Jake got arrested for drunk driving. Again. This time, instead of calling me to bail him out and find him a lawyer, he called Dad. Dad was dealing with his own relationship drama, more on that later, and told Jake he needed to figure it out himself. Jake spent 3 days in jail before finally calling a bail bondsman. He had to use a public defender because he couldn't afford a lawyer. His case is still pending, but he's looking at losing his license and possibly his job. Week 6. Mom had what she called a medical emergency, actually a panic attack, and called an ambulance instead of calling me. At the hospital, they asked who her emergency contact was, and she realized she'd been using me as her emotional emergency contact for so long that she didn't have anyone else listed. The hospital social worker asked about her support system, and Mom broke down crying, admitting that she'd been depending on her daughter for emotional support since her daughter was 9 years old. The social worker referred her to a therapist who specializes in codependency. Week 7. Dad's affair was discovered by Mom when his girlfriend called the house demanding to know why Dad hadn't left Mom yet like he'd promised. Apparently, Dad had been telling his girlfriend for months that he was going to divorce Mom and move in with her. Without me there to help Dad work through his feelings and strategize how to manage both relationships, he'd just been lying to both women and hoping things would work themselves out. Mom kicked Dad out, but then had a breakdown because she didn't know how to handle the divorce process without me to research lawyers and hold her hand through everything. The really fascinating thing has been watching how they've tried to replace me as their emotional support system. Sophie started trauma dumping on her coworkers until HR had to have a conversation with her about appropriate workplace boundaries. Jake tried to make his elderly neighbor his new crisis hotline until she told him she wasn't his therapist and to stop calling her at all hours. Mom started oversharing with her hairdresser until the woman raised her prices and started limiting conversation to hair-related topics only. Dad tried to make his brother his new emotional confidant, but Uncle Mike told him he was too old for this high school drama and to get therapy. One by one, they've learned what I learned at age 9, that most people aren't willing to be someone else's unpaid therapist, and that expecting that level of emotional labor from others isn't normal or healthy. Meanwhile, I've been thriving in therapy. My therapist has helped me understand that my family essentially groomed me to be their emotional caretaker, and that breaking free from that role was necessary for my mental health. I've also been learning about healthy relationships through watching my boyfriend's family. When his sister had a crisis last month, the whole family rallied to support her, but they also encouraged her to get professional help, and they took turns providing support instead of dumping everything on one person. It was the first time I'd seen a family handle a crisis in a healthy way, and it made me realize how dysfunctional my family's patterns really were. The most validating moment came when I ran into Sophie's former college roommate at the grocery store. She recognized me and said, "Oh my God, you're the sister who gave that wedding speech. I heard about it through mutual friends." I braced myself for criticism, but instead she said, "I lived with Sophie for 2 years and watched her call you for every tiny problem. We all thought it was weird how much she depended on you. I'm glad you finally stood up for yourself." She told me that Sophie's college friends had actually discussed how unhealthy Sophie's dependence on me seemed and how they'd tried to encourage her to develop better coping skills. But Sophie would always say, "My sister doesn't mind, and Emma likes helping people." It was like getting external validation that my perception of the situation wasn't crazy or exaggerated. Last month, things took an unexpected turn when Aunt Carol invited me to Thanksgiving at her house. She said she'd been thinking about our phone conversation and wanted to do something to show support for my boundaries. I was nervous about going because I knew some extended family members might have opinions about the wedding situation, but I decided to try it. It turned out to be the best Thanksgiving I'd had in years. Aunt Carol had invited several family members, but notably hadn't invited my immediate family. When I asked her about it, she said, "Emma, you deserve to have one family gathering where you're not managing everyone else's drama." During dinner, my cousin Linda mentioned that she'd heard about the wedding speech through family gossip. Instead of criticizing me, she said, "Good for you. I always wondered why Emma was the one everyone called with their problems. It never seemed fair." Other relatives shared similar observations. They'd all noticed the pattern, but hadn't felt comfortable saying anything. Several people apologized for not speaking up sooner. My uncle Tom, who's a therapist himself, pulled me aside after dinner and said he'd been concerned about the family dynamics for years. He told me that what I'd experienced was textbook emotional parentification, and that my decision to set boundaries was not only appropriate, but necessary. "Emma," he said, "you didn't abandon your family. You stopped enabling their dysfunction. There's a big difference." The holidays without family drama were surreal but amazing. No crisis calls, no one needing me to mediate arguments, no one dumping their relationship problems on me. I actually got to enjoy the holiday instead of managing everyone else's emotions. That same week, I got an unexpected message from Sophie's husband, soon-to-be ex-husband. He apologized for not speaking up sooner about how the family treated me and thanked me for the wedding speech because it helped him understand why his marriage was failing. He said Sophie had been trying to recreate the dynamic she had with me in their marriage, expecting him to be available 24/7 for emotional support, getting angry when he couldn't fix her problems, treating him like her personal therapist instead of her partner. He told me that during their separation counseling, the therapist had pointed out that Sophie's emotional regulation skills were severely underdeveloped, likely because she'd always had someone else, me, managing her emotions for her. "You probably saved my sanity by cutting her off," he said. "She's finally in individual therapy learning how to cope with emotions on her own." Around this time, I started getting messages from other family members who'd been at the wedding. Apparently, several people had looked up information about emotional parentification after my speech and recognized similar patterns in their own families. One of Mom's friends messaged me saying she'd realized she'd been doing the same thing to her teenage daughter and had started family therapy as a result of my speech. Another relative said my speech had inspired her to set boundaries with her own emotionally dependent siblings. I never intended for my wedding speech to become some kind of wake-up call for other people, but apparently it resonated with a lot of family friends who'd observed our dysfunction over the years. 3 months post-wedding, the family dynamics have settled into a new, healthier pattern. Sophie is in individual therapy and has stopped trying to contact me. Her therapist apparently told her that she needs to respect my boundaries and focus on developing her own emotional regulation skills. Jake is in court-mandated therapy as part of his DUI plea deal. He's also been required to attend AA meetings, which has forced him to confront his alcohol use and the emotional problems he'd been dumping on me instead of addressing. Mom is seeing a therapist who specializes in codependency and has started taking antidepressants. She's learning how to manage her anxiety without using her children as emotional support animals. Dad is living in a studio apartment and going through a contentious divorce. He tried calling me once to talk through his feelings about the divorce, but I reminded him of my boundaries and hung up. He hasn't called since. As for me, I'm doing better than I have in years. My anxiety is under control, my relationship is stronger, and I'm excelling at work now that I'm not constantly distracted by family crises. I've also started volunteering with a local organization that helps teenagers who've experienced parentification. It's been healing to help other young people recognize that their family's emotional problems aren't their responsibility to solve. Some people have asked if I regret my wedding speech or if I feel bad about how everything played out. The answer is no. I regret that it took me so long to set boundaries, and I regret that my family's dysfunction damaged all of us. But I don't regret standing up for myself or refusing to continue enabling their unhealthy patterns. My therapist says that sometimes families need to completely fall apart before they can rebuild in a healthier way. Maybe my family will get there eventually, or maybe they won't. But either way, it's not my job to fix them anymore. Final update. It's been a full year since the wedding speech that changed everything. everything. I wanted to give one final update on how things have played out long term, because I know a lot of people have been following this story. The past year has been a journey of learning what healthy family relationships actually look like, and unfortunately, learning that some family members aren't capable of or willing to change. Starting with the positive changes, Mom has made the most progress. After about 6 months of therapy, she reached out through Aunt Carol asking if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. I agreed, but only with the understanding that this was about her acknowledging past mistakes, not me resuming my role as her emotional caretaker. At that coffee meeting, Mom gave me the first real apology I'd ever received from my family. She acknowledged that she'd been using me as her emotional support system since I was a child, that it wasn't fair or appropriate, and that she was working hard in therapy to develop healthier coping mechanisms. She didn't ask me to forgive her or resume our old relationship. She just took responsibility and told me she understood why I'd set boundaries. We now have lunch once a month, and our relationship is completely different. She shares basic life updates, asks about my job and relationship, but doesn't trauma dump or ask me to solve her problems. When she mentions something stressful, she follows it up with what she's doing to address it herself or with her therapist. It's the first time in my adult life that I felt like I had a mother instead of a dependent. Sophie took much longer to come around. Her marriage ended in divorce after about 8 months, largely because she couldn't break the pattern of emotional dependency. Her ex-husband told me later that she'd actually asked him to call me and convince me to resume being her support system because she was struggling without Emma. He refused, which led to a massive fight where Sophie accused him of not caring about her family relationships. After the divorce, Sophie went through what she called her dark period, about 6 months where she cycled through various inappropriate emotional support sources. She tried leaning on coworkers, casual friends, even dating apps to find people who would provide the constant validation and crisis management she'd been getting from me. None of these relationships worked out, obviously. Around month 9, Sophie had what sounds like a genuine breakdown. She ended up in the emergency room with a panic attack and finally accepted that she needed professional help to learn how to manage her emotions independently. She's been in therapy for about 4 months now and reached out to me 2 weeks ago. Unlike previous attempts at contact, this message was different. She didn't ask for anything, didn't try to guilt me, and didn't minimize what had happened. She simply said, "I'm learning in therapy why what I did to you wasn't okay, and I understand why you can't trust me anymore. I'm working on becoming someone who could be a real sister to you someday, but I respect that you don't owe me that chance." I haven't responded yet, but I appreciated that she's finally understanding the difference between apologizing and making amends. Her therapist is clearly doing good work. Jake, unfortunately, hasn't made much progress. His court-mandated therapy ended after his DUI case was resolved, and he immediately stopped going. He's been through 3 jobs this year because he keeps having emotional outbursts at work when he's stressed. Last I heard from Aunt Carol, Jake was living with a new girlfriend who's apparently become his latest emotional dumping ground. She's 22 years old, which makes me worried that he's specifically targeting someone young and inexperienced who won't recognize his emotional manipulation tactics. I've considered reaching out to warn her, but my therapist has helped me understand that I can't save everyone from Jake's dysfunction, and trying to do so would be falling back into my old patterns. Dad has been the most resistant to change. He's remarried to the girlfriend he was cheating with, and apparently tried to turn his new wife into his emotional support system. According to family gossip, this led to significant problems in their marriage because she expected him to handle his emotions like an adult. He tried calling me twice this year, both times during what sounded like relationship crises with his new wife. Both times, I reminded him of my boundaries and hung up. He hasn't called since. The most surprising development has been with extended family. Several relatives have mentioned that my wedding speech made them reevaluate their own family dynamics and set healthier boundaries in their own relationships. My cousin Linda started family therapy with her teenage kids after realizing she'd been parentifying her eldest daughter. Uncle Mike had a conversation with his brothers about their pattern of using their sister as an emotional dumping ground. Even some family friends made changes to how they handled emotional support in their families. I never intended for my speech to have such a ripple effect, but apparently calling out dysfunction publicly gave other people permission to address similar problems in their own lives. As for me personally, this year has been transformative. I've continued therapy and have learned so much about healthy relationships, boundaries, and emotional regulation. I've also been able to explore parts of my personality that were suppressed when I was constantly managing other people's emotions. I discovered that I actually enjoy conflict resolution and helping people when it's appropriate, reciprocal, and part of a healthy relationship. I've been considering going back to school for a counseling degree, ironically enough, but this time, it would be my choice to help people professionally, with proper training and boundaries, not because I was groomed to be a family emotional caretaker. My relationship with my boyfriend has gotten stronger throughout this process. He's been incredibly supportive of my boundary setting and has helped me learn what it looks like when someone genuinely cares about your well-being instead of just wanting you to solve their problems. We've talked about marriage, and for the first time, I feel like I could have a healthy partnership where emotional labor is shared equally. I've also developed friendships that aren't based on crisis management. It's amazing how much more energy you have for fun, supportive relationships when you're not constantly dealing with other people's drama. The biggest lesson I've learned this year is that you can't love someone into being healthy, and you can't sacrifice yourself to save other people from the consequences of their choices. My family's emotional dysfunction wasn't my fault, but continuing to enable it would have been my choice. Setting boundaries wasn't cruel or selfish. It was necessary for everyone's well-being, including theirs. Some family relationships survived the transition to healthier dynamics, and some didn't. That's sad, but it's not my responsibility to keep unhealthy relationships alive just because we share DNA. I'm proud of the progress Mom and I have made, hopeful about potential future progress with Sophie, and at peace with the fact that Jake and Dad may never be capable of healthy relationships with me. The little girl who was trained to put everyone else's emotional needs first has grown into a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to accept less than she deserves. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself as your family's emotional caretaker, I want you to know that you deserve better. You deserve relationships where your needs matter too. You deserve to have your own emotional crises supported instead of minimized. You deserve to live your own life instead of constantly managing everyone else's. Setting boundaries feels scary and cruel at first, especially when you've been conditioned to believe that other people's emotions are your responsibility. But on the other side of that fear is freedom, peace, and the possibility of genuinely healthy relationships. The family ATM is permanently closed, and the family therapist has officially retired. Some people have asked if I ever wonder what would have happened if I just continued being their emotional support system. The answer is that I know exactly what would have happened. I would have had a complete mental breakdown, probably lost my job and relationship, and possibly ended up hospitalized for severe anxiety and depression. My family's emotional needs were a black hole that no amount of support could fill. They didn't want to get better. They wanted someone to manage their problems so they didn't have to face them. By removing myself as an option, I forced them to either develop healthy coping mechanisms or find professional help. Some of them rose to the challenge, and some didn't. But that's not my fault or my responsibility. The best part of this whole experience has been discovering who I am when I'm not constantly in crisis management mode. I'm funnier than I thought, more creative, more adventurous. I have opinions about things other than other people's problems. I have hobbies that aren't related to fixing anyone. I'm planning a solo vacation next month, something I never could have done when I was on call 24/7 for family emergencies. I'm learning to paint, which requires the kind of sustained focus I never had when my phone was constantly buzzing with family drama. I've also been able to be there for people in healthy ways. When my friend Sarah went through a difficult breakup, I was able to support her without taking on her emotions as my own responsibility. When my coworker needed help with a family crisis, I could offer practical assistance and emotional support without becoming enmeshed in her problems. It turns out that when you're not emotionally depleted from constantly managing other people's crises, you actually have more to give in appropriate, boundaried ways. Last week, I got an unexpected piece of mail, a graduation announcement from Sophie's stepson, who I'd helped tutor years ago when his parents were going through their divorce. He'd included a note saying that he'd always remembered how kind I was during that difficult time and wanted me to know he was starting college with a full scholarship. It reminded me that there had been positive aspects to my caretaking role. I had genuinely helped people and made a difference in their lives. The problem wasn't that I cared about others. It was that I'd been conditioned to care at the expense of my own well-being and without any reciprocity. Now I can choose when and how to help people, and I can do it from a place of strength rather than obligation. The anniversary of the wedding speech passed quietly last month. Instead of dwelling on family drama, I spent the day hiking with my boyfriend and having dinner with friends who've become like chosen family. That evening, I went through my old journals one more time before finally throwing most of them away. I kept a few entries that showed my growth and progress, but I didn't need to carry around 17 years of documented emotional labor anymore. As I was throwing away the journals, I found an entry I'd written at age 16 that I'd completely forgotten about. It said, "Sometimes I dream about what it would be like to just worry about my own problems. I wonder if I'll ever get to be a normal teenager who only has to deal with homework and boyfriends instead of everyone else's marriage problems and mental breakdowns." Reading that broke my heart for my teenage self, but it also made me incredibly proud of the woman I've become. That teenager's dream came true. It just took 10 more years and a very public boundary-setting speech to make it happen. I still keep a journal, but now it's full of my own experiences, thoughts, and growth instead of crisis management notes. I write about art classes and weekend trips and work achievements and relationship milestones. I write about therapy breakthroughs and personal goals and dreams for the future. For the first time in my adult life, my journal is about my life, not everyone else's problems. If you're still reading this incredibly long saga, thank you for following my journey. Writing these updates has been therapeutic, and knowing that my story has helped other people recognize and address similar dynamics in their own families has made all the difficult parts worth it. To anyone who's currently serving as their family's unpaid therapist, you are not responsible for other people's emotions. You are not required to sacrifice your own well-being for others' comfort, and you deserve relationships where care and support flow both ways. Setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish. It makes you healthy. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for dysfunctional people is to stop enabling their dysfunction. The family therapist has officially retired, and she's never been happier.